So in this video, we're going to look at the sanctity of life topic. So that includes the concept of the sanctity of life, different views about its application to issues concerning embryo and unborn child, the just war theory and its application to the use of weapons of mass destruction. So firstly, let's talk through the concept of the sanctity of life. So the sanctity of life principle is the idea that human life is sacred to God or is holy. The principle comes from the Bible. So primarily in the creation story, where it states that God created humans in his own image. It says, God created humans in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So the key here is that humans are created in the image of God and therefore are believed to have special intrinsic value. In the Bible, it also explains how God breathed life into the first human being, which reinforces the view that human life is especially valuable. So it states in Genesis 2, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." So the Hebrew word used for breath here, nefesh, is often used for soul. Since human beings are the only part of creation into which God breathes, it's often believed that only human beings have a soul. This is what is believed to set human beings apart from the rest of creation, supporting the belief in the sanctity or special, holy quality of human life. Further evidence in support of the sanctity of life can be found in the book of Jeremiah, where God addresses Jeremiah the prophet, saying, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." This text implies that God knows each of us personally, even before we've been formed in the womb. And so it's particularly relevant, this teaching, when considering issues relating to the embryo and the unborn child, but it's also relevant for any discussion around the sanctity of life because it implies that special relationship between God and human beings. So there are two forms of the sanctity of life principle, strong and weak. So the strong sanctity of life principle suggests that all human life is completely sacred to God at all times and in all forms. Strong sanctity of life suggests that life begins at conception and that the right to life is absolute, irrespective of any circumstances or situations. So this might seem familiar because it's a view that's consistent with the primary precept to preserve life and overall with natural moral law. Then we have weak sanctity of life. So this is the view that while life is sacred to God, in some extreme circumstances, other considerations such as the quality of life or the person's own wishes must be taken into consideration. Now, this view stems from the idea that when God created human beings in his own image, God gave human beings the ability to make their own decisions. Now, this view, again, might seem familiar because it's somewhat consistent with the emphasis on agapeic love and personalism and relativism within situation ethics. So, what we need to do now is think about how the different views about sanctity of life can be applied to issues concerning the embryo and the unborn child. But let's be really clear here what kind of things we're talking about when we're dealing with issues concerning the embryo and the unborn child. So there are kind of three main areas that it's really helpful for you to know and really helpful for you to be able to reflect on in your work on this topic. So firstly, there's embryo research, then pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and then lastly, and perhaps most obviously, abortion. So embryo research. This is research aiming to improve medical knowledge using tissues or cells from embryos. Most research in this area concentrates on stem cells, which are taken from early embryos in a process that ultimately will destroy the embryo. So pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is where embryos are screened during IVF treatment to prevent the inheritance of genetic defects. Disease-free embryos are selected to be implanted. And abortion is the induced termination of a pregnancy to destroy the fetus. So let's talk about the application of strong and weak sanctity of life to each of those three issues. So firstly, embryo research. So the strong sanctity of life principle would suggest that life begins at conception. Therefore, anything that harms the embryos at any stage is not permitted, and it's the equivalent of murder. Since embryo research leads to the destruction of embryos, the research has to be seen as wrong, since it goes against the primary precept to preserve life and the commandment not to kill. However, from the perspective of the weak sanctity of life, embryo research may help to save lives in the future by enabling researchers to identify cures or effective treatments for diagnoses that are not currently treatable. It can be argued that saving an actual life of someone who's alive and is suffering could be more significant than preserving a potential life in the form of an embryo. And it could be an example of putting Jesus' teachings about agape love into practice to actually engage in this form of research. Because potentially what could be happening is that God-given gifts could be being harnessed to help heal people. So pre-implantation genetic diagnosis could be seen to be a tool that can improve the quality of life. However, Christians who support the strong sanctity of life would be opposed to this, since the principle says God values all human life equally, irrespective of genetics. Christians who adopt the strong sanctity of life view may argue that screening for genetic diseases sends the message that individuals with these diseases are not as valuable. Those who believe in the strong sanctity of life would also be concerned about embryos being discarded as a result of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. As you can see there from the infographic just to the right, obviously you may have like 5 embryos. Only those who are unaffected by the genetic issue are going to be transferred. So you would then have like 3 embryos that would be discarded. So Christians who support the weak sanctity of life side may actually argue that pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is a good thing, because they may argue that it's actually important to ensure that there is quality of life. And again, they may say that's consistent with Jesus' teachings about agape love. It can be argued that decisions need to be made carefully to balance the potential impact of a life with a genetic disease and also careful consideration of the future quality of that life. So the key thing to note here is that whereas the strong sanctity of life view would be opposed to pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, once again, Christians who support the weak sanctity of life have a much more nuanced perspective on this issue. Lastly, we have abortion. So under the strong sanctity of life principle, abortion would never be permitted. This is because life is believed to begin at conception. And so even in the case of rape, even in the case of incest, the strong sanctity of life principle would dictate that abortion is not permitted. This is because abortion is seen as destroying the image of God and violating the intrinsic value that God has given every life. So the strong sanctity of life principle would essentially override any considerations about the quality of life of either the mother or the baby. However, from the perspective of the weak sanctity of life, an abortion can be considered to be acceptable in relation to a fetus that's severely disabled and so would have a very low quality of life. Once again, the point can be made that it could be the more loving thing to do to allow for a termination of that pregnancy. And it could also be potentially argued that in case of rape or incest, it could be the most loving course of action as well. So how do the different denominations view these issues around the embryo and the unborn child? Well, the Catholic Church, of course, views issues around the embryo and the unborn child from the perspective of the strong sanctity of life principle. It's also important to note that some evangelical Protestant Christians also share this view. So the Roman Catholic Church teaches that human life begins from the very moment of conception, because from that moment a unique and sacred life begins, independent of the life of the mother and the father. From the beginning, the very beginnings, the moment of conception, the Catholic Church views this not as a potential human being, but as a human being with potential. And this has informed the teachings of the Catholic Church in the Catechism, which states that human life must be absolutely protected and respected from the moment of conception. So here we can see just how the strong sanctity of life principle has become embedded in the teachings of the Catholic Church. The weak sanctity of life principle is typically followed by the Church of England and also many other Protestant denominations. From this perspective, the fetus is seen as a potential life rather than like an actual life, although there are some variations in terms of interpretation here. It is recognised, though, by Methodist Christians, for example, that the longer the fetus is in the womb, the stronger its right to life becomes. So Christians who support the weak sanctity of life principle may argue that the quality of life should be considered when making ethical decisions about human life. It may be argued that since we've been given autonomy by God, so the ability to use our free will to determine our own actions, we should be able to make rational decisions for ourselves.